Let's start with, just a little bit of movement that we're seeing in terms of reform. In New York State, they are passing a broader package. These are not huge reforms, but they are, in fact, reforms. Where is it here? Number 2. And this one is a good one in New York State. I'm having trouble finding it. They have passed a law that basically, or I should say they repealed a law that was protecting the disciplinary records of cops. And so you would have no sense. Here it is. Both houses of the New York State Legislature have passed a bill that repeals Civil Rights Law Section 50A. This has been on the books for 45 years almost. And it shielded police disciplinary records from public view. Of course, this is highly problematic. The guy who, the public was not aware that Pantaleão, the guy who choked Eric Garner to death in 2014, had an abysmal record of misconduct. No idea. And he was kept on the force for, what was it like? Almost like 2 or 3 years. He was suspended or something, but this is just it's a small little piece that helps put pressure on the entire system to hold to account cops who are violent or inappropriate or whatever it is. Apparently this is part of a larger package. Not sure exactly of the other things, but I don't think they're quite huge, to be honest with you. Meanwhile, we talked about what the Democratic offering was in the House the other day. Republicans are pushing 2 separate bills, apparently. I don't know what's going to be in them. I don't think they're going to be terribly impressive, but the idea that they have to respond, I think, is important. And of course, Tim Scott is going to be the guy who he is the only
the most
black
embarrassing essentialism that they just tapped Tim Scott. Just,
oh yeah,
of course.
Oh yeah,
of course.
He was appointed by Mitch McConnell to lead the efforts. Do we have a picture? Brendan, did you pull that picture of the interns? I know this is sort of like...
Oh, we did.
Yeah, I know this isn't like a big deal, but it's a nice shorthand to explain the dynamic that's going on here. And frankly, I think it could be, in many respects, while we have, sort of ongoing issues about class, about money, this, I think, era in many respects is will be defined in many respects, I think, by race. Donald Trump got into office, largely, at least from a Republican perspective, by being the champion of the birther movement. It was, in many respects, a response to having an African-American president, which racialized everything for a lot of people, in some ways good ways, in some ways bad ways. But put this up there. This is the Barack Obama, I guess, interns, right, that they have. Now, there's a real problem with interns, just broadly speaking, and I don't know if they get paid at all. But I
was going to say, trust that class is at the center of these intern classes.
Without a doubt. But with that said, there's no reason to believe the people in this picture have any more or less money than the people in the next picture. But there is a big difference. Just zoom in just a little bit more so that we can really get a sense of this. Okay. Yeah. All right. There you go. Okay. All right. Now let's see the latest iteration of our existing president. There it is. You notice a little difference? There is literally one black person, and I think a woman who
Indian woman.
She's Indian,
South Asian.
South Asian woman.
Yeah, South Asian, and at the very least, a lot of people who can present as white. In fact, everyone else who can present as white. Now, I have no reason to believe that anybody, when we talk about, what class they come from, that they are, I would imagine, all children of wealthy people. Maybe there's a couple who are not, who knows? But broadly speaking, that's why I say that in many respects, this era is defined by class, because there is a certain constant within American society that may be even that certainly is a massive problem we have. But when we talk about the differences of these eras, I think in many respects that really captures some of it.
That's there's a really great talk I just watched I think it's called Policing Beyond the Technical Fix by Cedric Johnson. And he's very good at delineating, like, essentially getting the one part of what needs to be done. And I guess there's a little bit of movement in the House bill, is very basic civil rights stuff, to the point that it's appalling and terrifying. Like, you need a federal ban on chokeholds. Like, what?
Right.
What? How is that acceptable? Like, and we've been and you can go and read Bill Bradley, 1990, saying that we need federal bans on racial profiling, and talking about New Jersey State Police. And then when you get into the more ambitious demands, like getting rid of broken windows, or what people have, or what they've renamed broken windows, or different versions of defunding and redirecting funds, then it does open up the whole class and economics game. So that's the big concern right now. It's obviously an improvement that the Republicans feel a need to pretend on the civil rights dimension.
Right.
But the broader ambition is still not in play yet.
Well, I think I think in terms of like those, I think the only mechanism that the federal government has to do something like cut their funding is to either cut, there's some programs they can cut, like the 1033, and stop giving them military hardware.
Yeah, that seems pretty basic.
But I think they could also, maybe the courts might have a problem with this. They could tie federal funds into structural reforms with the police. Like, right. You could maybe say police cannot be the first responders for people who are who might be might have mental issues.
Absolutely.
Or there may be mechanisms in which to do that without running afoul of a Supreme Court that had a problem with expansion of Medicaid. But for the most part, a lot of this stuff has to happen locally. Although this is interesting.
I just real quick, I think not only, it's the Supreme Court is one thing, but I mean, as far as the types of interventions that could potentially be done federally, there's things like you just mentioned, and also this incredible disturbing paradox that the systemic abuse and racism and class structure that defines policing, it's all about over-policing and terrorizing certain neighborhoods and communities. And then on the other hand, actually, when it comes to like actual crime, under-detectivizing them, in the sense that not investigating murders, not investigating serious crimes. And that's why you'll see in the polling those, very interesting contradictory numbers of, on one hand, absolutely the police are biased, absolutely they lie, absolutely they're abusive. And then on the other hand, for other things, where the hell are they?
Someone, I think I may have mentioned this the other day with Vitali, but Jill Lavoie wrote a book called Ghetto Side, I think it is, that makes that very same argument, that there's too many cases that just don't get resolved in Black communities. And so they don't bother throwing.
Waz and I talked about the difference between the boys in blue and the detectives.
Right.
The completely different policing infrastructure, And I think it should also add, when people talk about defunding, to explain the specifics of what you mean. in terms of what is going to get rolled back and eliminated and redeployed, and what is actually just broader question of democracy and public safety, which everyone's entitled to.
Right. This is also very interesting. There are supposedly, I think, up to 12 cases that the Supreme Court may or may not grant certification to. In other words, to hear in the coming the next session. But a federal appeals court yesterday was looking at the case. This is a civil case of 5 cops in West Virginia who were sued for shooting a black man 22 times while he lay motionless on the ground. Someone told me recently that cops, that is a technique that they learned from the Israeli Defense Forces, that you just keep shooting until there is absolutely no movement. You do not hesitate. And a Judge Henry Floyd, an Obama appointee, we make a practice of doing that these days because it becomes very clear on just how important the person who appoints these judges are in terms of their rulings. The Fourth Circuit wrote on behalf of a unanimous 3-judge panel. We have talked in the past about this concept of qualified immunity. And last week we went into it a little bit deeper, but it essentially means that unless that as a rule, if you are a police officer or any really working on behalf of the government, that you have immunity from civil lawsuits unless a court has ruled specifically on a specific incident like this in the past. It's a legal, it's not a statutory thing. It is a legal, principle that has been developed through the courts. And they said, and they cited George Floyd in this, that to dismiss the case against these officers who shot and killed Wayne Jones, this isn't a ruling. This is just they're ruling on a motion to dismiss based upon this concept of qualified immunity, quote, would signal absolute immunity for fear-based use of deadly force, which we cannot accept. They went on to say, although we recognize that our police officers are often asked to make split-second decisions, we expect them to do so with respect for the dignity and worth of Black lives. Before the ink dried on this opinion, the FBI opened an investigation into yet another death of a Black man at the hands of police, this time George Floyd in Minneapolis. This has to stop. Floyd, of course, not related to George Floyd, the judge, I should say. A district court judge had granted qualified immunity to the officers, finding at the time that Jones was shot, that he wasn't secured, it's a legal term, by the officers. So they hadn't used excessive force under the clearly established law on the issue. This is a guy who apparently, Jones, who was killed, had been, was unhoused, and was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so under the proposals that people are talking about, both in terms of dealing with qualified immunity and in terms of rolling back funding for the police and repurposing that money into support for housing and into support for people with mental issues, in 3 different ways, this shouldn't have happened and wouldn't have happened under these reforms, presumably. And so a really interesting case to note, because it's going to be curious to see if this is just another one that heads up to the Supreme Court. I obviously, I think if you've listened to the show for a long time, know that I think the power of civil lawsuits is pretty substantial, and in terms of changing behavior, and particularly when there is an absence of actual government regulation and reform and oversight of these things, because then it's the last game in town, essentially. But it's good to see that we're seeing this both on like a state level. We're seeing it, obviously, we talked about what's happening in Minneapolis. We're seeing in California, I think Garcetti said that he was going to cut significantly the budget, the police budget. De Blasio says that he's going to cut it, supposedly. I don't know exactly how much.
Yeah, I'd watch Carcetti and Garcetti and de Blasio very closely on that.
Yeah, I mean,
and Minneapolis too. I mean, for what it's worth. I mean, there's a lot of devils and a lot of details right now.
Indeed, but that's why I think it requires a lot of like ongoing pressure, but to hold to at least these broad things. My daughter just brought me some hot tea.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, that was very nice of her. She apparently heard my voice is not doing very well. So here is